Итак, добрый день, уважаемые спикеры. Добрый день,
Good day, dear speakers, dear colleagues, dear participants of our today's session, Industry 4.0 Competitiveness of Kazakhstan. Let me welcome you. I'm Dusimbayev Medziet. From Kazakh Ventures. I'm deputy chairperson of our organization, and I'll be the moderator for the session. As you know, and it's no doubt that the fourth industrial revolution is the biggest challenge for our country, but it's a historical opportunity to join 30 developed countries. The vision of our head of the country is to join 30 developed countries through introduction of the elements of Industry 4.0. Today we got together to discuss the current position of our country under the conditions of Industry 4.0 and how it can have an impact to increase competitiveness and what barriers we do have to increase competitiveness of Kazakhstan. Here we have very prominent speakers. Let me introduce them. Yerzhanov Amnias Kasimovich, Vice Minister of Industry and Infrastructure Development. Mr. Kenneth Rogov, Professor of Economy of Harvard, the Senior Economist of the World IMF. Anastasia Kalinina, Head of the Regional Agenda for Eurasia, the World Economic Forum. Mirmanov Nurlan, Managing Director on Innovations of Kazakh Telecom. Mr. Anders Jonsson, Head of the Innovation Policy of the Department of Economic Cooperation and Trade of Eurasian Economic Commission for UN. And Mr. Dmitry Nikolaevich Peskov, Special Representative of the President of the Russian Federation on Digital and Technological Development. A bit of the structure of our session today. We shall start our discussion. We shall have discussions and speeches, 7-10 minutes. Then the Q&A session. As you see, we have selected this hall for our audience to ask questions in a comfortable zone, and then we shall finalize. In order to create the foundation for our discussions, the first question will be addressed to you, Mr. Vice Minister Amnias Kasimovich. Tell us about the current situation and achievements in achieving the objectives of the industrial development and what measures are taken by the government to eliminate all the barriers and bottlenecks. Thank you, dear forum participants. Welcome to the session. And now let me welcome to you at the session, Industry and Competitiveness of Kazakhstan. The world has come to the epoch of digital globalization, which is defined by the flow of data with information, with innovation, ideas and innovations. Based on the cost of experts by 2020, 25% of the global economy we shall pass off to digitalization, which will help to business and the governments to function effectively. Developed countries successfully modernize their economies. They rapidly develop the innovative technologies where the artificial intelligence, automatization, digital platforms domineer. For our enterprises to be competitive in the foreign markets, we need to follow this trend. That is why, based on the task of the first president of Yelbasi, we developed and adopted the state program Digital Kazakhstan, under the framework of which the ministry did the work to develop measures for incentivization aimed to create the necessary ecosystems to support our enterprises which are actively implementing digital technologies. We defined the major barriers and challenges on the way to digitalization of our industry. This is not enough understand of the benefits from digitalization, lack of the qualified HR, insufficient development of domestic technologies, limitation of funds, insufficient development of the infrastructure to eliminate the barriers Using the international experience, we developed the system-based measures aimed first to popularize the digital technologies in the business environment, development of domestic technologies and competencies to develop HR and incentivize and to create the conditions for development of industrial internet. We had a comprehensive approach to it jointly with our German partners to create 7 digital parks. We completed the technological audit in the enterprises. We improved the roadmaps on digitalization implementation, of which will make it possible for them to become the demo platforms about digitalization, to increase the competence of technical specialists and to define the barriers on the way of implementation of certain specific projects. As for the financial measures, in order to pass over to Industry 4.0, we have created initial conditions through the supportive measures and reoriented certain measures of support with focusing on digitalization and promotion of digitalization. We need to state the work which is carried out by big industries, enterprises like Glencore in digitalization, ArcelorMittal, ARG, Polymetals. They implement projects on introduction of the technology of the fourth industrial revolution in the enterprises. On the examples where they have introduced digital and technologies, we already see how they are supportive to increase efficiency of the processes in the companies, to increase the competitiveness. The economic effect in the year 2030 from the implemented projects in these companies made more than $50 billion. Thus, now in Kazakhstan, we actively create conditions to introduce the digital technologies in industry. This year, we shall scale up the positive experience of these enterprises across the regions in the country. We shall actively work on digitalization with 100 enterprises up to 2022. The work on digitalization of the enterprises will happen on the platform of Technopark Astana Hub, where we plan to create a single portal to support and incentivize both industrial, innovative, and startup projects. The portal will carry out the work to collect technological tasks and to find the solutions, acceleration in finding the projects, ensuring the necessary infrastructure. At the same time, on the basis of Astana Hub, we shall develop the platform Industry 4.0, which is aimed to solve the technological tasks of industrial enterprises. Dear colleagues, digitalization of the Kazakhstani industry is just the first but very important step in developing the digitalized society. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Manias Kasimovich, for this contentful speech. I think that we are all pleasantly surprised about our achievements, but you have already mentioned what are the barriers. You mentioned about development of the local domestic technologies, about development of qualified and skilled HR, and about industrial internet. You mean, of course, the normative legal base. You talked about the real economic effect from introduction of new technologies. You said $15 million. Yeah. You mentioned about the infrastructure level. Infrastructure level in Kazakhstan is well developed. These are such institutes as Kasper Ventures, AIFC, Astana Hub, Gas Center, utilities. Such infrastructure institutes are available. We have the strategy. We have the message of January 2018, where the Vice President talked about 10 system-based steps transferred to the industrialized revolution. We have the intention to join 30 developed countries. You talk about the practical things happening, that audits are carried out, research is being carried out, which proves that new technologies have a serious impact on productivity, competitiveness of the country. But as we understand competitiveness of the country in the national market can be different considerably for the competitiveness where Kazakhstan can be placed in the global market. Today we have Professor of Economy and State Policy of the Harvard University, one of the leading researchers in the area of benchmarking of economies. Mr. Kenneth, I want to ask you a question. Tell us, please, how you can evaluate the impact of the fourth industrial revolution on competitiveness of Kazakhstan. What is your vision about increasing the competitiveness of Kazakhstan in the global scene using the elements of the fourth industrial revolution? Will it give an impulse to avoid the target economy to the new economy based on Industry 4.0? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak at this forum. I certainly want to start by saying the achievements of Kazakhstan are utterly remarkable. I'm old enough to remember after the independence, I don't think people realized Kazakhstan was going to do as well as it did. There were people who thought Uzbekistan would be the place that was growing much faster. And certainly for a long period, Kazakhstan was the fastest growing per capita income country in the world next to China. So these are remarkable achievements. That's something that, of course, is very difficult to sustain. And I might add that Kazakhstan has managed to do this despite being landlocked. I think it is the most successful landlocked country in the world. I might be missing something. Obviously, it's surrounded by a challenging geopolitical environment. So I have some suggestions and critiques, but let's understand that this is in a position of great success. So first, directly addressing the question, this is certainly not the first time this has happened. And I think the short answer to the question of what to do about industrialization 4.0 is the same basic approaches as with 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0, good governance, a competitive private sector. I think what's probably more challenging in this situation is that due to the interplay between technology and globalization, marked by the rise of China, but not only China, things are moving very fast. And that makes it more difficult to adjust. As to where the future of jobs is going to be, I think economists just disagree about this tremendously, people who work on it full time. There are people who think that eventually we'll see a normal pattern of jobs where middle class jobs, which we can't even imagine right now, emerge, and there's balanced growth. There's a significant camp that argues we're headed to a dystopian future in which capital owners will become ever richer with workers seeing their income shrinking. My own view is that there's a good chance that the more optimistic take will prove to be correct, but certainly you never know. Kazakhstan faces, I think, a really important additional challenge because it's very difficult to diversify an economy when the natural resource sector is so dominant. Kazakhstan's been discovering more oil. Many other places are seeing their oil resources shrink. That's a good thing, but it makes it harder to diversify the economy. It makes it harder to increase the size of the private sector. It makes it harder to reduce the role of the state. Economists often refer to the concept of Dutch disease because you have a dominant resource sector that bids up wages and makes it difficult for everyone else. So there have certainly been some reports. I refer especially since I was once chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, but not only for that reason. There have been a number of reports by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund that have tried to identify areas where Kazakhstan could strengthen its productivity and have a more flexible response. And the most important one is to try to develop a more diversified private sector, more competitive and diversified private sector in which small firms and businesses feel they can compete domestically and internationally, and even in some areas challenge the large state-owned firms. This is a very difficult transition. This isn't something anyone does easily. The political economy is very different. For example, I know that Kazakhstan's considered privatization on a larger scale than has happened so far, but that disrupts entrenched interests. That's very, very difficult to push through. If you look at Asia, that's really the area which has been the most successful in transitioning from poor to middle income to upper middle income. The strategy has not been to eliminate the state sector. The strategy has been to allow the private sector to grow. And if you look across many of these countries, the state sector has grown, but the private sector has grown much faster, and that's achieved more balance in the economy. In order to do this, they're very difficult changes. Everyone faces them. This is something in every country, including mine, of trying to weaken the grip of politically connected, dominant firms. I'm talking about Kazakhstan, but I could be talking about the tech sector in the United States, where the monopolies have grown too big. They need to be broken up. Everybody sees this, but they're very, very powerful politically, and it's difficult. Kazakhstan also faces that problem. I think there's certainly other problems having in some areas. Corruption has referred to in the IMF and the World Bank, trying to deal with this. Now, some specific areas where I think Kazakhstan might have advantages. I think the Astana International Financial Center is a very well-conceived idea. It doesn't mean it will work. It's risky. It's a big project. But of course, to the extent you're working in a digital space, the disadvantage of being landlocked, of not having easy transportation, could potentially be overcome. There's room to use the fourth industrial revolution in more mundane areas, for example, agriculture. In many parts of the world, I've seen it in Brazil and other countries, agriculture is very high tech. And trying to develop productivity in agriculture as the Silk Road project unfolds, hopefully Kazakhstan will have more export opportunities for its agriculture. This is also an area. The oil industry is going to grow, mineral extraction, but this requires technical skills, services, other inputs. At the moment, my impression is a large percentage of these are imported. That's not something, you can't easily move away from that, but I think, again, that's an area to try to strengthen competitiveness. And potentially, once you develop these expertise, it's something that might be re-exported to the rest of the world. And then I guess I just conclude by saying, the very fact that Kazakhstan holds forums like this one and prepares, I think, this very interesting report which underlies this discussion shows that it's been very alert to these issues. But they're not purely economic issues. They're also political economy issues that every country faces. And as you develop, they get harder, but I have every confidence that Kazakhstan will continue to perform well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rogov, for your very clear-cut and informative information. The audience applauded you. It's very pleasant to hear that you are an optimist. You confide in us. Yes, there is a Dutch disease. We know about it. It exists. But as for creation of conditions for the private sector, favorable conditions, and to change ourselves, with this, I agree, and I think that our Institute of Development is in line with this. We are starting to change ourselves. We are trying to meet the requirements of the market, of our clients, of the ecosystem. And now we have three focus of the Custard Ventures. It's venture-based funding, creation of smart money, attraction of investors, creation of business ecosystem and eco media. The next is support to business incubators, accelerators. By this, we help to develop the startups, the youth startups, and the ecosystems, and then we carry out the expert technological support. And I think that the major evaluation of competitiveness of the country must be based on something. We have different ratings, and Kazakhstan, in the results of these global ratings of the global index of competitiveness last year, was ranking 59. It's the International Economic Forum, and one of its subdivisions of the Global Economic Forum, which is the center of the Industrial Revolution in San Francisco, which is our partner. This is a partner who jointly with us is organizing this very session, and today the representative of the center is Mrs. Kalinina. For our session last year, we signed an agreement between the government of Kazakhstan and the Global Economic Forum about cooperation with focus on IoT, the fourth industrial revolution. I want to give the floor to Mrs. Kalina. Tell us about the very interesting projects which are happening in your center. Tell us, please, about the center itself and how cooperation we are waiting for and where we shall come. With my greatest pleasure.
The English language at the World Economic Forum. I would like to maybe bring this conversation more to the global level and talk about, as you mentioned, the fourth industrial revolution and the way we at the World Economic Forum describe it. We usually look at it as the simultaneous and rapid transformation of multiple areas of technologies, such as artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, which you mentioned, blockchain, gene editing tools, also the new materials, the advanced manufacturing, the drones, all sorts of technologies that are changing the way we live, the way we work, the way we communicate, just about everything about how the world is right now. These advances are merging the physical, digital, and biological world, so it's quite unprecedented what is going on in the world right now. And what we have learned at the World Economic Forum is that whatever the experts predict will will actually happen much, much sooner. And we definitely have seen the example like that when different teams across the world were trying to master the Chinese game of Go. It was about 2015, where people were trying to come up with a mechanism that will beat human beings in this game, which is very complex. And when asked about when they think this will happen, experts usually refer to a time frame of 10 to 20 years. That was 2015. In March 2016, the AlphaGo, designed by DeepMind, the UK-based company, released the version of the program that bet the world champion of the Chinese game Go 4-1. So this was one of the examples that actually it happens much faster. Everything that we know will happen is happening way too soon. So experts could no longer predict the future as we know it, and we could no longer refer to the past as our reference point. Instead, we could look at the future that we want and then work backwards to try and achieve it by building the technological regulation together. So that's exactly what we're trying to do at the World Economic Forum. About 2 years ago, we have started the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution in San Francisco. Now we also have offices in India, China, Japan, and right now we have the third wave of bringing the new offices. Parallel to that, we're also developing collaborations with countries across the globe. Kazakhstan is one of them, and I'll speak to that a bit later. But first I'll describe what is the ultimate goal of this center. So the goal is to accelerate the policy making related to new technologies that I mentioned, because usually the policymakers take their time regulating them, and we don't have that time at all. So our goal is to work with the public sector, with businesses, with civil society, and design the forward-looking policies in a much faster way. These protocols have to be very fast, very agile, so we actually use the self-imposed milestones of about 18 months to deliver the projects and the prototypes. Just to give you some examples, I can start with something that we do in the UK. The project is called Unlocking Public Sector AI, and there we identify use cases that would need most urgent attention. If you look at technologies related to artificial intelligence and especially machine learning at this point, we're now at the phase where algorithms are developed from the data itself. So there's no source code, there's no human being developing them, and they will be more powerful than any human insight. So the fundamental questions there would be, who owns the intellectual property of those algorithms? Who owns the data? What happens if the data is coming from multiple sources, and if something goes wrong, who is ultimately liable for the mistakes? So these are the questions all leaders, we believe, should look at, and we're helping the UK look at those things together. In Rwanda, we help implement the drones regulatory framework. They have clinics over thousands of islands, and it's not possible to build a road network, to bring electricity. Instead, they're using drones to deliver their goods and services. But because there's no regulation, or there was no regulation, it's difficult to scale this. So what we did together with the government of Rwanda, we created the first and still the only regulatory framework for security and safety drones based on performance benchmarks. It took us 4 months. Now they can scale it all over the country, so we think of this as a success story. Another country we work with is Japan. It's an aging country with a declining population. They peaked at around 125 million. Now they're on decline, and 4 million people in Japan are suffering from dementia, and it's going to double in the next 10 to 20 years. This could be quite dangerous for the Japanese economy. So what we're doing with the Prime Minister Abe and his government is we collect data from different sources, put it in the container, and use machine learning algorithms to come up with new solutions to understand the late-stage brain diseases. So that's quite a different example from the first one I mentioned. Another example, you mentioned, Mr. Rogov, the agriculture as a great potential field for these technologies. In India, because of climate change, the monsoon cycles are becoming very irregular, so the farmers could not possibly predict what to plant when, and oftentimes they're losing their crops, they're losing the yield, they're losing all the income. And because in India, 500 million people live off of agriculture, it's quite fundamental to make sure there are different solutions in place rather than just relying on monsoon. So our project in India included instrumenting the fields that collect real-time data on the soil using IoT. So we use sensors, precipitation data, soil condition data, sunshine data to understand what to plant when, and it has significantly increased, and it could increase even further the quality of life of the farmers. For all of this, the regulatory framework is needed. We cannot rely on things just happening. We have to drive this proactively. So my main point would be, how do we ask ourselves those questions? What do we do right now to make sure we are in control of these technologies before they are in control of us? So this is exactly what we're pioneering at the World Economic Forum, and I'm very happy to let you know that we are now working with Kazakhstan on the Internet of Things. This technology was picked as a field where we will develop together with you the regulatory framework. And the great thing about this is that hopefully some other governments in the world will pick this up and try to implement it in their contexts and in their homes. So in about 1 year to 1.5 years' time, we will have the first prototype. We're working with the Ministry of National Economy with this and also Kazakh Ventures. So we are quite excited that this is happening. We look forward to continuing this collaboration. And again, we may think that these things are somewhere in the future, but in fact they're already here, they're already happening. So we better, as the leaders of business and public sector, take control of them and try to come up with solutions for regulating them. This was a quick introduction to yet another dimension of the fourth industrial revolution, and we can discuss this further later. Thank you.
Большое спасибо, Анастасия. Вы затрагиваете...
Thank you very much, Anastasia. Well, first, we started with barriers, about what barriers and bottlenecks are faced by business and what the tasks the government tries to solve. You talked about the normative and regulatory basis, which is a very important element for development of the ecosystem and innovations. But before I ask a question, Mr. Peskov, because we watch our colleagues, we watch our partners from Russia, and we see that, in fact, the standards of IoT, the technical committees in Russia are actively working. But before we talk about the experience of our neighboring country, I want to listen to you, Mr. Nurlan Mirmanov, about what are the changes happening in our country in the sphere of IoT, because Smart Akol is the first smart city project, which was implemented by Kazakh Telecom, and every year you hold forums on IoT. And what barriers do we have for business as of today, which can be solved through introduction of new standards, through introduction of new laws? Tell us, please. Thank you very much. I welcome all participants of the forum and of our session. Really, I want to share with practical experience of introduction of technologies which are related to IoT. Please show the first slide of my presentation. So many questions are related to the technological readiness of operators. You can read about it in mass media when we shall have IoT, in fact. But everything is so linked. The economy, operators of communication, consumers are sort of a chain of links. It's impossible to introduce or to use IoT without availability of technologies. If we talk about technologies, we have a huge range of accessible technologies. They are available. They compete with each other. They are accessible to the operators. We deployed a big network copy one in the country. We offer it as a basis for application in the utilities. But the matter is not with the technologies. We have some pilot connections, 2,000 devices which work already in a grid, and the transfer data in real time, and the mechanism is applicable and is operational. But there is a question, and I want to share about experience, and I want to share about the relocations. What are the other accessible mechanisms for data collection which are used actively? Yes, they are energy resource companies, local administration don't want any changes. They talk so much about Industry 4.0, but they don't do anything. Maybe they lack time, or maybe they lack budget. But if you look at the experience of other countries, it's better not to talk about this Industry 4.2, but to support it in practice. You have said the standards of data collection are at a level like about resources, volume of consumption of water, energy, heat. Maybe we can establish certain KPIs for governors based on the information that we collected, maybe through settlements, so payments which have been collected, and they can be submitted in digital form, but not in paper format. Because we are used to paper bills and we pay based on the bills. This is the joint work of the market, of the regulating body, and the communication operator, which can shift us to the processes and to the better understanding and to this methodology of Industry 4.0. As for this industry, project. So in one of the cities, we wanted to build the architecture on the basis of Industry 4.0 in one of the city facilities in a small city, Akol. The architectural layers include the following elements. Yes, there should be some center for analytics, monitoring, collection of information, which can be used for tarification, for reporting, for planning of the city infrastructure. But to ensure all this, we need to have the infrastructure which can be provided by the operators of communication of the elements of Industry 4.0. There is so much of literature about transport infrastructure. It is ready for OB1, for O-band. Yesterday we demonstrated the technology 5G. It will be the technological base ready to the maximum to connect a big number of devices to the grid simultaneously. What can we digitalize in the cities? CCTVs, online regime, we can collect information, not to collect it just for having it, but to have video images so that we can track the events. We need the online monitoring from streets, for penalizing people for traffic violation, to see the concentration of people where they shouldn't be. Smart metering systems, this is the online regime of governing the cities. The technology is ready, but not a single city in Kazakhstan is not using it, and maybe we have the problem with the regulations. As for smart illumination, street illumination, we launched it. It's a very effective mechanism. We have got used that in the evening in the cities, we have lighting everywhere, but in big cities where they have smart street illumination governance, they turn it on when people are moving. It's implementable. It's not expensive. As for such big areas like application of some technological new research in Industry 4.0, so many research has been done. Let me talk about them. Transfer to this industry with insignificant investments enables us to save 4-10 times our costs and to ensure efficiency for production. And I'll share the information. Those who invest in the research in Industry 4.4 in application of new technologies, they should be, we would think that they should be operators of communication manufacturers, but in fact, that's not. The biggest investors are the group of company Volkswagen, which is the group is a leader. We see the transformation happens in auto industry, and then Toyota. They are involved in technological mechanisms which helps them to pass over to the new economies. And we, as representatives of business in Kazakhstan, we want to see that such things are happening in our country. The world debated already from application of the technologies in a certain industry area. On the contrary, development of industry happens if there are such new technological opportunities like 5G. Technology 5G introduces two new economic terms, internet in GDP, around 10% of research exists about it. Internet in square, which is multiplied by intelligence by 2035, the impact of it will achieve 50%. Many companies realize it and they come to understanding that transformation must be done in the area of digitalization of data and use of big data. And yesterday at the big data session, we showed how we can use the data which is available, how we can use it for urban planning. As operators of connection, we have a good understanding where are located our basic lines. We know that there is overloading in the streets, and we showed in which streets of Astana our subscribers can stay a long time. We are not naming them in person. These are depersonalized data. These are the data and information for the municipal bodies, for them to take measures with decreasing the load of certain places. We see where people move from, where do they move. For instance, we see that at 6 o'clock morning, they from outskirts come to certain concrete places in the city, and we even know the number of people. That's why we can make these places safe, decrease the load of traffic, transportation, and people. And maybe we should expand such streets and build in pedestrian roads. This happens in Moscow. Mayor of Moscow, they actively use big data. They use it for methodology of city planning, urban planning. They use this methodology of Industry 4.0. As talking about Kazakhstan, we are finishing with the building the LoRa network. We are ready to ensure receiving and transfer of data from utility facilities, but we don't have any mechanism for collection of data. But for it, we need the whole ecosystem. Let me show how it looks in the market of Kazakhstan. There are so many parties. For them to work well, we need to regulate it. Everything should be beneficial to everybody who is involved. Manufacturers must produce, suppliers must have the chance for selling. Companies, developers need to have standards for commissioning the facilities so that they will have everything fulfilled. So it is a market, and the operators will have to modernize the infrastructure, and they will have to ensure the infrastructure. Thank you very much, Nurlan, for your expert opinion, informative view. I think, Anastasia, we shall have to do a lot of work in terms of regulations, in terms of initiation of the legislation-based initiatives. And I want to give the floor to Mr. Peskov, special representative of the Russian Federation about digital development. Mr. Peskov is a co-author of the Model Digital Economy of the National Technological Initiative, one of that in Russia. As I have already said, they are moving in terms of the standards development and in the regulatory basis. It's very interesting to learn about your experience in your country. Thank you, colleagues, for your invitation. I shall not be so optimistically minded as the previous speakers, but I can share my pessimistic views in several aspects, which are very important. Number one, the first thesis or statement, lack of the model for the future brings to the non-critical borrowings of the terms which create the strategic risk for development of Kazakhstan. when we place in one row the notions which have a fundamental nature, like the fourth industrial revolution, and equalizing it to the marketing concept of the group of the German companies on the thesis of Industry 4.0.4, you as a country are losing the chance to develop your own technologies and value-added production, and are just buying ready solutions. In this way, you guarantee to yourself preservation of the raw-oriented economy for your country. It is number one. Number two, evaluation of the deadlines and the critical borrowing. And about critical borrowings. Without the critical analysis and just studying only the best of experiences proposed by IMF will bring you to the wrong assumptions. Talking about evil programs, for instance, victory in AlphaGo, you can give examples when the forecasts were not implemented or realized. Let me remind you that several years ago, in all materials of the Eastern Economic Forum, as a recipe, we proposed a model from the company IBM in solution on Watson. In the sphere of healthcare and diagnostic in oncology, that there was a promise that we shall do it immediately in the clinics of US. Not in a single clinic, this solution was implemented. We are not critically accepting the best practices about immune cities. I'm very happy that WEF Center is placed in San Francisco, and with a big attention, we read the reports about the systems of security in smart cities as of one element of the fourth industrial revolution, digitalization. Everybody knows what happened 3 days ago in San Francisco. No? Do you know? Yes, the mayor of San Francisco banned to use the technology of identification of faces in San Francisco. The next thesis or statement. Non-critical comprehension of technologies brings to the granted failure in the area of information security, creates for the country unbelievable scale of risks. The use of non-duplicated, non-reserved channels for instance, building AI solutions through the mechanisms of the so-called cloud computing will bring to the opportunity, in case of some catastrophic scenario, of the switching off of the services or facilities, industrial enterprises, non-critical selection of the technological standards when we talk about the subject of our IoT. IoT is not a technology. IoT is a marketing term. It has a crazy number of very competing technologies with different standard approaches. Kazakhstan selected for introduction the net LoRaWAN. Colleagues, any LoRaWAN net is now critically vulnerable for simple attacks from 4.8 modems, which beat the canals of the broadcasting at the level of big cities. The mechanisms for such attacks already exist. And here we talk about vulnerability and risks that you undertake. Yes, you can take them, but take them with open eyes, looking into the risks with open eyes. We cannot talk only about advantages, but we are not talking about risks. And it's a wrong policy. Now about the Russian approach. We understand that the scenario of the global development is controversial nowadays. It seems to us that any scenario, as of today, any strategy, national must take into account different risks, absolutely different opportunities. We divide into 3 waves all the processes that are going on today. Digitalization, for example, hype in digitalization that we have. The cream is taken by banks. We are talking about cryptocurrency, we are talking about retailers, but before the real changing in the industry, no, the time has not come up to it. If we think that in the old enterprise you will put sensors and you will get a radical growth of production, no, it's not true. The results of your experience show $50 million. It's a fact. If you don't have in your life cycle at the very early stage the technology of using the digital du- duplicators which use the whole historical memory of the whole cycle of production, then what you do is not an industrial revolution. And the number of sectors, the biggest sectors, they have not come up to this level at all. Some of them, like banks, my telecom, yeah, maybe they did it, but some others, the biggest industries like constructions, have never come up to this point. Some experiments, like reprinted, can give a result within 2 years or even 20 years. Introduction of the robotized cars will happen in Arizona wonderfully, but in the nearest future, we had a discussion with Paul Ramer, a laureate of the Nobel Prize on Economy of the last year, and colleagues from big corporations promised that it will be promptly introduced from the consulting companies. And Paul asked, my focus was that in the countries where we have the winter, so it will be 2030. But he said it's 2050. So we see we're talking about different evaluations, difference in evaluations. And we live in this world on the basis of these evaluations. In Russia, we had the first wave of digitalization, the second wave with the industrial changes, but we are missing the real wave, which doesn't have anything to do neither to figures, neither to industry. It is it has a relation to the change of the land, which we'll call nature similar technology, so morphing. And a small reflection of it is a green agenda in development countries to it. And this is a major challenge for the country like Kazakhstan, which critically depends of small changes of climate changes. You know wonderfully that agriculture and extraction and a number of other things in your country exist in the temperature regime, which is a bit sensitive to climate changes. It's a real risk, and if you don't focus on it, you create something. And I can say that you are brave people. That's why in Russia, the third wave with which we work under the framework of the strategy is a wave of terraforming and appropriate technologies. For them, we need standards and to work with the data, and you're absolutely correct with this. But the sovereignty of data can enable any country of the world sustainably pursue its own policy. If you don't have the sovereignty of data, you are critically dependent from a number of factors. That is why, while finishing my speech, again, I call to you, be attentive in evaluation of risk, talk about them openly, and always ask questions. This is a technological solution which you choose. Does it ensure to you the right of control over using it and aftermath from using it or not? Thank you very much.
Большое спасибо, Дмитрий Николаевич, за ваш
Thank you, Dmitry Nikolaevich, for your pessimistic and actual response. Thank you very much as you touch upon the issue of risks, and I think that it's absolutely correct. For us to pass over to the risks and to discuss them, we shall listen to Mr. Johnson, who for long has been focusing on the economies of different countries, about development of economies when introducing innovations. I want to warn you that after Mr. Anderson Johnson, representative of the Institute of Economic Research, Saibol Argangazinov will talk. Please join us. Institute of Economic Studies is co-organizer of our session, and they wanted to briefly inform you about the research was carried out jointly. And after these speeches, we shall pass over to Q&A. Mr. Anders, we are listening to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here with such a distinguished panel. I come from, I'm responsible for innovation and competitiveness policy, dialogue and research of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, one of the 5 regional commissions. And we work very intensely with post-Soviet and post-communist states, especially Kazakhstan, on promoting innovation and competitiveness, and we look especially on the policy side, the policies and institutions that are necessary. So I was happy in that respect also to hear from the World Economic Forum, and basically all the speakers who were, I've been ticking off things I wanted to say here that I'm not going to say now because you've already made these points, so I will improvise a little bit also in the interest of time. We always use history, we always instrumentalize history to promote the narrative that we want to promote today. So we should take all of this with a grain of salt. But with the benefit of hindsight, there's a standard narrative that's been emerging that goes something like this. It used to be easy. Economic development used to be relatively easy. All you needed to do was to have competitive wages, invite investors to come to your country, engage in labor-intensive manufacturing. You would slowly start to gather the skills that you needed to move up the value chain, to diversify, and especially if you were in sectors like electronics, the skills that you developed, the capacities that you developed, not only the skills, but also the linkages and the investors and the financial intermediation capacities, the institutional capacities, were such that you could use them in other sectors as well. And so you would diversify, and after a while, when you come to a middle income status, you would find out what you can really be competitive in, and then you would narrow your export basket, and you would focus on those sectors, and you would move towards developed country status. Now, this sounds good. First of all, I don't know if it's exactly true. I know that, especially among development economists, there's skepticism about this. But definitely, if you look at East Asia, this has been the case. Now, the problem is this is probably not going to work in the future. We've already seen since the 1990s, we've seen manufacturing as a percentage of GDP, and especially as a percentage of employment, go down, while manufacturing as a percentage of capital investment has gone up. So it means it's becoming more capital intensive. And if you go to the US right now, you can go to a chicken farm and you will have 1 million chickens supervised by one single person. Right? This is all done by technology. It doesn't mean necessarily that the chickens are doing well. That's a separate discussion. But it means that there's an enormous incentive to accumulate capital as your wages go up. And when we think about the technologies that we think will be driving what we think, or what we call right now is the 4th Industrial Revolution, although actually some would argue that it's already going on, or that it's part of the third. We can have that discussion separately. But this trend is going to continue because these technologies are becoming cheaper and cheaper to use, and some of them are becoming free, like Facebook or online courses from Harvard. You can sit now in a village in Uzbekistan and you can access online courses with a distinguished professor like Professor Rogov for free. But you need to take these opportunities. So the question is, where are the jobs going to come from in the future, and especially in Central Asia and in Kazakhstan? And it's a very simple answer to that. We don't know. What we do know is that there will be enormous changes and enormous opportunities out there. But you need the people, the institutions, the entrepreneurs that continuously explore what is out there, what is possible, what works, and what does not. And that brings me to some of the overall policy recommendations I wanted to make, and then I'll give an example of a country that, at least to some extent, seems to adhere to those. So think of your policies and your institutions as having one goal: to enable people to explore opportunities systematically and to scale them up. All kinds of opportunities. We're not only talking about economic opportunities here. We're talking about governance. We're talking about building communities, rural development, basically all areas of sustainable development. The first place, of course, to start is infrastructure. We know about the hard infrastructure. I don't need to go into a lot more detail into that, but also soft infrastructure. This is both formal education, but also informal education and especially culture. You become what you value. Athens became great because it valued learning. Florence became great because it valued, to be honest, money and art. Edinburgh became great despite of the adversity that it faced at the time. The second issue, of course, we need good macro policies. They're always good to have. We need to have institutional stability. We need to balance the budget. We need to avoid inflation. But it's often not enough, or that's at least something that's emerging from the experience that we've seen over the past 50 years. The third point is that technology is not the goal. It's not even the starting point. What you should think about are ideas for everything. Now, many of these can use technology well, sometimes boring technologies that are already out there, and sometimes new and frontier technologies, but they're not the starting point. The starting point shouldn't be, let's invest in Internet of Things. The starting point should be, what are some of the needs that are out there that are not met right now? And what can we do to meet those needs and create jobs and contribute to sustainable development? Another point is that I welcome, and that's happening already in the region, as of course Mr. Pryskov also mentioned, is the importance of cities. You know, cities bring together the different elements that you need to innovate, to think about new ideas, to try them out, to experiment with them, to find capital for them, to find the skills that you need, to find the markets that you need, and to scale them up. Cities have been drivers of innovation, and they will continue to be. And initiatives like smart cities, I think we should see in an overall context of enabling this kind of innovation and experimentation on the one hand, and diffusion to the rest of the economy on the other hand. The latter is actually maybe even more important than the first, and for countries like Kazakhstan, because if you look at the most productive sector and the least productive sector, you have an enormous gap between them. This is partly, of course, because of the capital intensity of the resource sector, but it's also because you have some very productive parts of the economy, but the knowledge and the skills from those productive parts of the economy are not filtering through to the rest of the economy, including some of the state-owned sectors, and that's a problem. There's something that's gumming up the system there, and there's an enormous potential that you can get just by freeing up whatever constraints that diffusion, or what stops that diffusion from taking place. And then the final point is echoing a little bit. My colleague from the forum talked about agile governance. The problem is that the approach that is unfortunately still prevalent in the region, where you have your 20-year plan, your 10-year plan, your 5-year plan, and then your annual plan, and you do different activities, and you measure based on very concrete outputs. So, for instance, if you support startups, I don't know if this is the case in Kazakhstan, but in many other countries, if you support startups, then you measure success by the survival rate after a couple of years. Innovation is extremely risky. This will set the incentives for you to invest not in the most innovative companies, but in the companies that maybe already cater to something that's already been established, and maybe even companies that would have been set up with any kind of public support. So you need a wherewithal in the incentives to experiment, both with public support, but also with rules of the game, with partnerships, with governance structures, with what you can do at the city level and what you can do at the national level. We can call this agile governance. We can call this, there are many other terms for this. There's new industrial policy also goes along these lines. But the important thing is to interact with society systematically and with the private sector and with entrepreneurs to scout out where these opportunities are, what the constraints are, if there's what we will call a market failure, a rationale for some kind of public support, and design that public support in a way that is transparent. And perhaps the most important thing to keep in mind here is not as much to get the analysis right, because you're never going to get it right, but to stop what's not working. And this is incredibly important. Like, I think most of the cases of failure of ambitious industrial policy that we've seen across the world is precisely because the incentives, the political will was not there to stop what's not working, and that's important. And this brings me to the example of to one example which I don't want to promote. There are no perfect examples out there, because remember, one of the things we always underestimate is how difficult institutional and cultural change is. You cannot simply say, now we're going to do our policies in a different way, and then all of a sudden it will happen that way. That's not the way things work. But there's a country called Israel, and it's surrounded by states. It's engaged in conflict with those states, and it has only basically one route out to trade. It has unfertile land. It's overpopulated. It has a dry climate. Why did it develop the way it did? Well, the reason is. The reason this started in the 1970s. If you imagine, there were very significant investments into defense technology to monitor the border, and for obvious reasons, I don't want to get into that whole story. But this triggered an enormous explosion in initially public-funded research into defense technology, and these were then expanded by entrepreneurs into a range of different civilian areas. And about 10 years ago, Israel was ranked one of the most propitious places for technology startups in the world, and you wouldn't have thought that even 30 or 40 years ago that it could happen. And this was supported by active government policies. First, of course, on the infrastructure side, investment in public research. These provided the fertile ground and many of the ideas that were since scaled up. But also an approach to economic development policy that did not limit itself to specific instruments in specific sectors. It's now set up something called the Israel Innovation Authority, which has basically no concrete programming. There are no standard procedures for doing anything. But what they do is that they engage with companies and startups in a dialogue. They get to know them. They find out what their plans are. They look at their ideas, and they try to find the ideas that probably will not happen without some kind of public support and public intervention. They evaluate those ideas based on what the potential social return could be, and then they decide to support or not, and they attach very stringent criteria to these support mechanisms, and there are different kinds of them. And they phase them out after a couple of years. If you don't meet objectives, you don't receive further support. And also importantly, if the support leads to successful entrepreneurship, the states make sure to recoup some of that investment through different mechanisms, different kinds of equity arrangements, and so on, which is also important. If you invest in something, you should also partake in the success. So that's why I'm happy to be here on the invitation of Kaztech Ventures. I think Kaztech Ventures is already thinking about doing something along these lines, and we would very much look forward to working with Kazakhstan on this. Thank you for the invitation.
Спасибо, мистер Йонсон. Очень
Thank you, Mr. Jansson. Quite good remarks about partnership for the benefit of our citizens in our countries. We have a lot of institutes of development, but they have their own strategies, their own plans for development. You are right saying that we need to join efforts in terms of joint, maybe projects which we can fulfill jointly with business. We can form working groups. And now the next point is that we need to stop to do what doesn't work, what doesn't begin to be good from the very starting point. And now we do it in our company. We shall help our holding company. And in Direct, we shall try to find vertical links. And we shall start to work with our partners from other institutes for development. Now, before we come to QES, a representative of the Institute of Economic Research wanted to share information about the research which was carried. Unfortunately, we don't have much time left. Thank you for the given floor. Dear ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you on behalf of the Institute of Economic Research and to brief you about the research which was conducted. It was done and dated to the Astana Economic Forum with Kazakhstan Global World Challenges and Opportunities, which is totally in line with our today's session. And as one of the risks, we named the technological risk and risks of cyber dependence. And as opportunities, 6 opportunities, we included integration opportunities, adaptations to the conditions of Kazakhstan of technologies of Industry 4.5, and using this opportunity, I want to thank for the active participation in our research, Professor Rogov, for the agreement, Mr. Dmitry Nikolaevich Peskov, for his readiness to participate. Thank you. You can find a very interesting information on our page. Please give a feedback after you look through it. Thank you, Yerbol. Now, colleagues, let's to the Q&A session. If you do have any concrete questions to the speakers, you can ask. Pass over the mic. Good day. Thanks, everybody, for the wonderful speeches. Founder of the Startup Leaf and the candidate for the School of Engineering School of Nazarbayev University that will make the exoskeleton for rehabilitation of the heart stroke. We are trying to find the solution, but our solution is linked to the data network. And we are talking about safety, but if there is certain attack, who will be responsible for the leakage of the data? And what is the role of the government in the regulation of the issues of cyber attacks and leakage of the information? Who is ready to make a comment? Kazakh Telecom? Let me do it. In our portfolio, in NTNE, we have 3 startups pertaining to exoskeletons and 10 technologies on neurorehabilitation. That's why I understand what they're talking about. Now, responsibility will be shared by everybody, from manufacturer up to the doctor who allowed to use this medical instrument. It's on the basis of the acting legislation of the national or international legislation, which would specify who will be responsible. We don't have anything like that in terms of the prospect. The most perspective would be the research which is carried out in Europe, which is related to the potential of using the insurance models. It looks like this. If, for instance, you allow the robot to do some actions for each action which for each action, the developer can send the money to the insurance fund, and then in the insurance case, the money can come from the insurance company. It's a model for the future. As of today, maybe investigation will bring to the responsibility of everybody who is engaged in this. Thank you, colleague in the first row.
Thank you much for the presentations. My name is Isam Shahab. I'm a professor of digital manufacturing at Nazarbayev University and the Cranfield University in the UK. When I joined Nazarbayev University 6 months ago, I started the first master program in industrial digitalization because there's a big race between technology and skills. And now technology is going so fast, so we need to increase the skills in the country. But my question now about data, because data is the backbone for any digitization in terms of digital twin and all of the digitalization technologies. So will the company in the future can share data? Because data is the heart for any companies. Do you think in the future the companies can share data?
Anders, can you? Who can? Who can? Of speakers? Nobody?
They couldn't answer.
Мне его не слышно. Просто есть какие-то проекты, которые реализуются здесь, в Казахстане. Это мы с Люфтганзой работаем. То есть много компаний работают, но они же защищают свои данные.
In the future, like governments or any organization can help companies to share data and keep their competitiveness?
Well, in Russia, in our digital economy national program, there is a concept, and it's already established by Russian government, of the so-called shared data pools. And these shared data pools should be the so-called data lake. Yep. So these data lakes are created by consortiums from biggest Russian technology company, mostly private and government-based companies also. So we have a national policy in this data sharing. So we think that it's really important. That's the key to competitiveness in future.
If I could add something. If I can add something also, this is obviously the question of data monopoly is, I think, the biggest question of the whole Industrial Revolution 4.0. I know in a country like India, they worry about places like Google and Facebook came in and they have all this data, and who owns the data? There are economists who propose the idea that individuals should own their own data and companies should have to pay them when they use their data, or at least inform them when they use their data. There are huge privacy issues here, but the question you've asked it's absolutely, I think, the central question of the political economy of the Industrial Revolution 4.0.
Thank you, Mr. Rogov.
Yeah, maybe I can try to to add something to that. I mean, the reason that we balked a little bit is exactly what Mr. Rogov explained very well. This is a central issue, and we potentially over 90% of the value creation that we can expect will be driven by data, but that's contingent upon how we can use the data and if we can use the data at all, and that boils down to, it starts with technical issues like the protocols through which the data is submitted, how we can control privacy. And just to give you one example, my father is a police officer, and he catches someone doing a crime with German license plates. He has to call, even now, the federal ministry in Wiesbaden, and they then take several days just to find out who is the owner of the car that they caught on video. This is absolutely fascinating. It has nothing to do with technology. It has only to do with governance, and in this case, overambitious data protection regulation. And this is a problem, of course, both within countries, but also intergovernmentally. And there's a very, very clear need for further intergovernmental cooperation and some kind of soft power leading into even some kind of hard power and some conventions on issues like not only data protection, but IP protection, electronic trade, and so on and so forth. We're working on some of those, but of course, there's only so much that we can do.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you very much. I'm told that it's time, but I want to take 5 more minutes of your time to thank speakers for your optimism, pessimism, for questions that were raised today. We have discussed the experience of various countries, the normative legal base. We discussed the barriers, where we should strive to, what we need to avoid. We discussed the risks, and I want to give each speaker one or two opportunity to make a takeaway, or to what would be the key messages for people to take them away with themselves. Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a very interesting discussion. Each country has its own approach. The colleague from the Russian Federation expressed his critical view. Each country has its own volume of economy, and everybody moves at the rate, at the tempo with each defined for itself to apply this or that technology. Experts can make a decision about it, but I think that the government must support and allow things to happen, but rather than to prohibit something to happen.
To summarize in a couple words, but certainly if we're looking at Kazakhstan as opposed to just the general abstract question of how to deal with the Industrial Revolution 4.0, I think there are very concrete steps that can be taken to improve competitiveness, to restore productivity growth, as I discussed earlier, having to do with trying to strike a better balance between having a dynamic private sector, having the state sector, having so much revenue come from natural resources, which is a great blessing, but at the same time creates challenges to have a more balanced economy. And there are many suggestions here of how to proceed with that. And it's these conceptual questions are very important of how to share data, how Kazakhstan will interact with the rest of the world. But I think the fundamentals to development are still the most important.
Mr. Rogov.
Mr. Rogov. Thank you very much. And again, I shall come back. The world develops rapidly, so rapidly that while you introduce something, think about whether you will return the investments IRR. It's critically important when you make a decision about any technology to be introduced. But unfortunately, in the epoch that we have approached, you cannot separate the technologies from policy. We see how such solutions become critically important. And again, the future comes too fast, and we must come to the future with open eyes. Thank you. Mr.
Yeah, I can echo the words of the other speakers. And I wanted to encourage people to think a little bit about how you should react as a government, but also as a society, to these developments as playing a game of chess. And of course, our chess grandmaster just left the room. I was hoping to look at him at this moment. That didn't work. But what's important is that if you play chess, you can be very competitive by practicing, by thinking about different openings, by analyzing different games, analyzing history. But you can't predict the future, and you have to be flexible. You can't have a strategic plan to attack the king side of your opponent if your opponent does something aggressive on the other side. You have to react. You have to adapt to circumstances. And you have to know your opponent, what your opponent is good at, and you have to observe, and you have to react accordingly at every single step. The same is for how agile governance or something like that would work, and that's important to think about. Now, having said that, let me say why this is not a good metaphor. First of all, we're not playing chess. It's much more complex than that. You have to imagine chess where you don't know how many squares there are. You think there are 64 squares, but there have been 64 squares in the past, but this can change. There can be 80 tomorrow or 90. You also don't know what the individual pieces can do. You can make an educated guess about how they will behave, but there are no set rules, or at least the rules can change. You cannot rely completely on history for it. That's the first reason the analogy doesn't hold. The second reason is that in chess, one person wins and one person loses. And this is not the case here, especially not in the long term. In the short term, yes, there will be some trade-off, but in the long term, we're looking at technologies that would make our lives and our societies easier and more livable. We just have to make sure to take care of the opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you. Спасибо большое, спикеры. Большое спасибо. Мы уходим.
To our speakers, we are leaving. Now the next session starts. Слушай, ну это